Mystery and Deceit, From Earth to Mars, Book 1 of Chaos's Orbit Saga, written by James T. Hall, narrated by Chris Pullman. Episode 11, How the Nanites Work. We weren't superhuman, James, just ones with advantages. The nanites fused into our very cells, boosted, at most, one or two attributes per person to extraordinary levels. Most of the time, that meant a keener intellect, better overall perception, more physical strength. In addition, of course, to better soldiering. But that much was due to nanitic programming. Basically, the nanites took a person's personal strength, or strengths, and built upon it, Eric said in response to my question. Then what about your legendary abilities to survive even the most ghastly attacks? Still extant in history texts were stories about how TDF elite troops would simply charge a machine gun nest, walking into and through fire, even cradle a grenade as it exploded, all without taking any serious physical damage. Once again, it was the nanites. As we based their behavior on biological organisms ranging from skin cells to beehives, they reacted as such. When we would be in battle under attack and get shot, the nanites would protect the host by taking the damage, even to the point of destroying themselves. Whenever one nanite was destroyed, another would replicate a replacement using stored energy and materials from the host, Eric replied with a shrug. Did the nanites ever fail to protect a host? In prolonged battle, yes. A host can only hold so much energy in reserve, Eric said. As he leaned forward a bit, resting his arms on the chair's arms, seeming to try and form a mental object with his hands, he continued, saying, think of a reactor. Once the reagents are exhausted, power production shuts down. The nanites, when they sense a low power reserve, stop replicating as fast or, in the most severe cases, altogether. When all the energy available is gone, the nanites simply go into hibernation, essentially retreating into the host and leaving him or her to fend on their own. It's a mechanism that was meant to save the host in the long term by giving the body a chance to regenerate its reserves while the host was in hiding. During the insurrection, though, the battles were so fierce that people simply fought on past that limit. So many good people died simply because they wouldn't leave their post. Then how did you get your reserves back? I asked Eric. Did you jack into a power source or something? It seemed an absurd idea, though. With how little information we had on the TDF elites, it was a plausible answer. Normally eating was sufficient, Eric replied. Our bodies were able to convert food into storeable energy at nearly 100% efficiency. The nanites simply helped our digestive system store food energy more efficiently. So what about those times of prolonged conflict, such as during the insurrection, I asked. There are first-hand accounts of how people, would stay on the front lines for days at a time. Was food still enough even then? Once we realized that the fighting would be nearly continuous, Eric answered, our best bioengineers, yours truly included, came up with new coding for our nanites which allowed us to gain energy from the sun exactly like plants do. How so? I asked, staring momentarily at the shelf of plants behind him. We always wore a thin layer of nanites to passively protect us, Eric said. After we figured out how and implemented the code patch, the nanites were able to function essentially as solar cells. Such solar capabilities, along with piezo generators which ran through most of our bodies, helped boost our energy reserves. In battle, however, that was more of a stopgap measure as more energy was being consumed than produced. My mind suddenly clicked, latching onto a passing thought. So that's how you people survived on Mars. The insurrection to our exile. Sure, that's a logical jump, Eric said. The thought had just occurred to me that if your nanites were always active in protecting you, and that they were able to, for lack of a better word, recharge you, that's how you were able to survive on Mars despite its hostile environment. Your nanites would still have been able to gather the power they needed to protect you from the original Martian atmosphere. And I think it would be reasonable to assume doing so took less energy than was gathered. At least I should think so if the original purpose of such energy gathering and storing systems were to help during battle, I said. You're not so dumb after all, Eric said with a smile. Very true. Our nanites did offer us enough protection against the environment on Mars, but they can only work with what's available, he finished. So, They function as environmental suits, but not spacesuits, I asked. Spot on. The nanites even protect against extreme pressure, as at least there's something to work with. So long as there is some sort of substance, the nanites can generally sustain the life of their host. I still wouldn't want to try jumping into a star, though, Eric said. Their interlocking nanitic matrices can be reasonably tough, but a star has a lot of heat and pressure. So that's how you survived, but what about the terraforming, I asked. Even now, we don't possess the technology to do what you people apparently did in the time you did it. Most theories on the Martian terraformation indicated it should have taken decades to accomplish what, according to soil records, had taken under one. That lack of knowledge is largely due to the government's shunning of nanitic technology, Eric said somewhat dismissively. Too many viewed the arbitrary creation and destruction of sentient organisms, despite them being hived and so more reactionary than sentient, as unwholesome, morally corrupt, or even as something the Supreme alone should have the power to do. And clearly you disagree, I said. Is it that obvious? Eric said. I was trying to hide it so very well. As the co-lead of the first project to create and harness nanites, of course I disagree. They can't feel. They have no sense of self. They are programmed nanoscopic insects. They protect their host as warrior bees do their queen, with selfless disregard. Turning again to face me, he said, "It all was simply an excuse to block the research." You feel that we as a society should be more advanced, that we would be, if we use nanitic technology, I asked. With nanites, we could specifically target disease cells, cancer cells, even use them to form a lattice and encourage repair of major wounds or organs. Amputation, organ destruction due to chronic damage could both be things of the past. We could regrow any organ from the inside out, Eric said, somewhat exasperated. So then, how are the nanitics used in the terraforming process, I asked, hoping to deflect some of his angst with the question. Believing that you wouldn't be interested or capable of understanding the details, Eric replied, let me just say that we first aerosolized the nanites to convert the atmosphere to a breathable mix of oxygen, carbon dioxide, etc. Are they still floating around today? I was suddenly worried, having lived on Mars my whole life, other than my trips off-planet for stories. No, of course not. Once they produced enough oxygen to sustain animal life, they self-terminated and then degraded over the course of time. They rusted away, Eric added, apparently thinking I wouldn't understand what he meant by degraded. Without a host, how were they powered, I asked. Nanite photosynthesis, just as in a host body, Eric said. But then how did they store energy? I mean, it's not always sunny out, I commented. Eric, exasperation edging his voice, said, well, of course they couldn't store energy outside a living being. They would simply go dormant at night, picking up their work when it was light out again. So, what about all the flora here? Our scientists contend that it couldn't have grown so abundant in such a short amount of time, I asked, thinking about how quickly Mars had been terraformed and covered in plant life. They didn't, at least not by themselves. We infused every square inch of Martian soil with nanites, set to encourage cell growth. Trees grew at a rate surpassing 1,000 times normal. In days, forests that rivaled the largest old-growth forests on Earth sprang up, all protected from the adverse soil conditions by the nanites, Eric finished, accenting the last of his statement with a raised eyebrow and a hand wave, reminiscent of a magician's ta-da. And those nanites, I said, were homegrown here on Mars from the minerals readily available in the soil. It's red for a reason. Likewise, once they were done with their work, they went dormant and decayed. We left no trace of their presence here, Eric said. So that's why you're so confident about nanites. You've seen the results. But what of such an accelerated growth process, I asked? Isn't that what forms cancers in living organisms? The answer was already clear. Nanites. However, being a journalist and not a biologist, I wanted to hear Eric's explanation. Yes, but again, the nanites provide the solution, of course. They're able to monitor their surroundings and trim cells that begin to exhibit abnormal growth patterns. In this way, any number of diseases, environmental or genetic, can be prevented while cells are still forming, still undergoing mitosis. Their very DNA can be pre-analyzed for defects. It's a proactive approach to disease that most research doctors tend to shun, even today, as it isn't nearly as profitable, Eric replied. Even so, why not bring such knowledge and data to the larger scientific community, I asked. Why not make your case and try to get nanites accepted as legitimate? After all, if nanites held such promise, why not try to reintroduce them in a more enlightened age such as ours, I thought. We did some time ago. It was shunned as unstable technology, pure science fiction with no basis. In fact, they had said, we tried to fight that fight, arguing it would only benefit humanity over time. Those in power, both in the scientific establishment and the government, were too scared of its possible implications towards human augmentation to allow even the most remote foothold in the workplace of real science, Eric said. There's still the memory that something of the sort was core to what happened in my time, to what befell Earth those centuries ago. Instead, they concocted stories of how cures already existed, such as we described. Courses of treatment for various diseases and conditions had been made, true, but not cures. They wouldn't listen, though, Eric said with a shrug. So we did try and fail to resurrect the tech. How were you at least able to improve in the attempt, I asked? Pardon? Eric seemed truly perplexed at the question, one that had seemed a logical next step in technological advancement, at least to me. Well, with technology where it is today, I imagine that you could have made the nanites smaller? Better. Have improved their design and function somehow. I could almost see thoughts beginning to pile upon each other in Eric's mind. It was as if such an idea had never truly occurred to him before. It is odd we would never have tried in that time to improve the tech, Eric commented. With so many of us working together on the research, you would think one of us would have brought the idea up in council. Looking back at that present, it almost feels as though a wall existed around such an idea at the time. Yes, a wall we could not surmount, but also which we couldn't see. As if something were intentionally keeping the idea from us. After another moment of contemplation, he waved off the whole train of thought. But no, there had to have been some reason why we didn't pursue such advancement of the tech. We would have thought of it if it were possible. What about now, I asked. Wouldn't it be possible now to improve the tech, I asked again. There was a slight tugging on my head. Well, Eric again seemed as though the thought of improving the nanites had never occurred to him. Even his just-spoken thought seemed to have left his conscious memory already. I should think so. I mean, with the right equipment and the best and most capable minds, perhaps, but none of those are real anymore, he said as he rubbed his right temple, and I certainly don't have access to the facilities to conduct such advanced research anymore. I would later come to find out that that was a falsehood. I mean, with the right equipment, one could massively shrink the hardware while improving its overall efficiency. Yeah, I'm just not sure right now how you'd go about that, which I find quite odd. Suddenly, Eric began slowly stroking his goatee while staring at the floor. Rarely did I see Eric concentrating and contemplating as hard as he was then. Normally, things simply came to him as easy as rain falls. Suddenly, after a slight twinge in my head, I found myself inexplicably curious about the whole affair. I pressed, how precisely could they be improved? Well, I mean, certainly they would no longer be nanites. I mean, with lasers alone, such as we have now, we'd be talking at least pico-sized, and at that level of tiny, the nanites would be able to interact with matter in a wholly different way. Instead of having to take on traits of things to act as catalyst within a host, they could simply construct the necessary catalyst from the subatomic up. They would machine substances in the body. Even the level of interplay between swarm and host would change. I mean, think of a construction site. So many different sizes of equipment could work in perfect harmony to achieve a level of sophistication and efficiency as we never thought of. Instead of nano-sized machines reaching across dimensions to effect change, they could network with and command their own army of Peakites to help. But even so, what sort of interdimensional plague could be achieved in such systems? Personal power plants could be rendered if Peakites could use the same dimension jumping as their big brothers to subtly move about subatomics. Nuclear fission and fusion, constant and safe, could be produced within cells themselves. Imagine every cell of the body is a power plant for a nanitic. Eric had been gesturing with his hands initially, now gesticulating with both arms while still staring at the same spot on the floor. He rose and began pacing as he continued. Such available power opens up a whole new avenues of possibilities. I mean, such an ability to create power at such levels internally would practically free a nanitic from physical limitations altogether. And with such a nano ecosystem operating at maximum efficiency and power, the nanitic could produce internally, from simple rearrangement of extant materials, all nutrients it would need. You're saying such a person would never have to eat? I asked. I'm saying that she would never have to do much of anything again. Eric's eyes widened almost beyond belief. He's grasped the back of his chair with one hand, continuing to gesture with the other, gazing off into different directions and possibilities as he did so. As much as our nanites could take salt water and turn it into a breathable atmosphere, Peakites would be able to remove the need to breathe. They could simply take waste products and realign their subatomic structure, causing a chain reaction of all such molecules to realign and become useful again. They could turn CO2 into pure oxygen, make acid into raw amino acids. The possibilities are astounding. Eric stopped, staring off into a corner of the ceiling while holding a statuesque pose, one hand raised, palm up, while the other continued gripping his chair. As I waited his continued discourse, I could swear that beneath us, in what I assumed to be his basement, I heard movement. After some time, what seemed like minutes, I cleared my throat, simply saying, "Eric?" His eyes came back to me, but they were devoid of color, a solid gray.
"You," came a chorus voice. "You've started something here that has changed time." It was the first time I had heard this chorus voices from Eric, though it would not be the last. It was a melodic voice, soft and strong at once, covering the entire gamut of human vocal range in distinct tones while seeming to meld into one spoken voice. "For many reasons we kept such a thought hidden. Among them we could not see what such an innovation would do. But as uncertain as the future is right now anyway."
The voices trailed off, as Eric's eyes seemed to swirl through colors I could just barely make out. Blue whirlpooled to greens that mixed through to dark browns and light hazels before returning to the light gray they had begun with. My mind raced, panic gripping it at what went on before me. Knowing some magic tricks as a hobby, I knew what I saw in front of me was not a trick. What was happening with and to Eric was real, and it scared me as the unknown scares any human.
"The path we had seen, that we had tried to trend down, is now bent. Where does it go?"
the chorus asked me as a child asks a parent, Eric's gray eyes somehow seeming to focus on me despite their lack of pupils. All at once he shook his head, closing his eyes. When he again looked at me, his eyes were their usual green. In them was confusion and concern. "What happened?" Eric asked me in his own voice. "I feel like I'm waking from a dream." I was actually hoping you might be able to explain that to me a bit, Eric. I'm a little more than freaked out right now. I remember impotence, possibility, roads opening through a dense wood. He truly seemed as though he were trying to remember a dream he had just had. Confusion played across his face. Nanites and possibilities. "Eric," I said, "really, what just happened here? I mean, I was here, but you weren't." Eric seemed as though he gained some small understanding from my offhand comment. "Say that again," he said, with clarity. "I was here, but you weren't," I said. "Your body was, but it wasn't you talking. And knowing illusions as well as I do, those were not your eyes." Realization seemed to dawn on Eric. "This is one reason I asked you here," he said, as he came around his chair and sat down again. "Things are changing within me, things I cannot control. Even if such improvement to the nanitic technology could be made, as we had been discussing, it would be too late for me." "Are you saying you're dying?" I asked. "Not quite," Eric replied. "The entirety of what is happening to me is a story for another time. Eric, I wish to understand. I was still getting over the shock of what I had seen, but suddenly I found myself much more willing to believe any story Eric might present me. The man sitting in front of me, a man who still manually tended to and kept houseplants, who only a few days prior had been no more than a stranger in a local pub, had shocked me to my core, and why I wanted to know how and why. Few things in my professional career surprised me anymore. I had interviewed people claiming to be demon-possessed or Satan himself, which generally were more fun than the messiahs to interview. End-timers, all of whom have been wrong, even various pets since the invention of the various forms of animal speak translation. While traveling in space, I had seen such beauty and experienced such unexplained phenomenon as to make a believer of an atheist and vice versa. During the water strikes in the old Middle East, I saw on the news how religious fanatics set themselves ablaze to make a point, and have even seen firefighters lift impossibly heavy loads just enough to save people trapped beneath. But never had I been so shocked. That chorus of voices had seemed to not just pass into my ears, but to touch my very soul. My heart had grown cold from its touch, and those gray eyes held me in a trance, willing me to pay rapt attention while simultaneously making me want to run in terror. Even so, I had to understand what had just happened, perhaps if for no other reason than that I saw an interview through to the end, whatever that end might be. "James," Eric said, now staring off through the front window, his voice carrying an uncomfortably familiar air. "It is not time for you to understand. But you will." Needless to say, such a statement did nothing to settle either my nerves nor questions. "When?" I pressed. "When the time is right, which it is not now," he said with finality. "Okay, fine then," I said. "To what subject can we return then?" "Not the Peakites. Your current knowledge would not lend itself to a rich understanding of such technology." "How about the local flora here then? How there came to be such a rich variety of species, even unique ones?" It wasn't something I was interested in, but thought it might lead back to a discussion about the Peakites. "Yes, we could talk about that. First, let me ask you something," Eric said. "Have you ever read the old book Dune by Frank Herbert?" No, I'm not familiar with it," I replied. "It was, rather is, a book series that was written during the 6th and 7th decades of the 20th century." "Too bad." Throughout that book, the author describes how people on a fictional desert planet go about terraforming it over the course of some 350 years. On this real desert planet, Mars, we followed largely the same ecological reshaping plan, though accelerated greatly thanks to the Nanites. "Of course," I agreed, hoping that eventually I might have been able to refocus the conversation. "As I had said," Eric continued, "we first used nanites to create an atmosphere tolerable to plant life. Then, relatively slowly, we began introducing increasingly more complex varieties of plants. The tough part was keeping the system in balance as we went. After all, while we could manipulate certain variables on a global scale, others we had to leave to Gaia. I honestly think the hardest part was importing the necessary fauna to complement the growing flora." "How's that?" I asked. "Think about it. We created a global oxygenated atmosphere. What do plants feed on in the air?" "CO2, I said, recalling my secondary school biology classes. "And how much of that do you think several thousand humans were producing on a planet, even this size?" "Not nearly enough, apparently," I replied after a moment's thought. "Correct. As we increased the plant growth, we had to increase the number and complexity of animal life here to keep the system in balance. It's easy at first. You bring in small animals that chomp down the growth, but eventually that population can grow out of control. So you bring in specific predators. Once that is in balance, you bring in more flora and more animals to keep the balance. Those animals, though, too often aren't prey for the previous predators, so new predators must be brought in. It's a constant push and pull when you're trying to create a planetary ecosystem from scratch. And the shit part is that you eventually run out of animals to import. Other than one." "You know the one animal of which I speak," Eric said in his professor voice, tilting his head slightly so as to look at me over his glasses. "My guess would be humans," I said after a slight grunt. "Exactly. At a certain point we had to start importing humans." "What do you mean by importing?" I asked. "You couldn't exactly bring humans here in cattle transports." "How do you think construction workers travel?" Eric said. "First class?" A chain of events unfolded before me, a knowing grin appearing on Eric's face. The government didn't start the settlement of Mars, did it? I asked. Nope, Eric replied. You and your kind devised a scheme to attract people here, forcing more and more population to follow to support them. Right, Eric said. All the while, quickly growing vegetation as the ability of human life to support it increased. Even righter, Eric added. Which is why there are still stories of people swearing that new forests and prairies would magically crop up overnight here on Mars, because they actually did. Spot on, Eric mentioned. And the whole while, you and your people use the influx of new population to allow you, once exiles, to silently reintegrate into society, I said, finishing my train of thought. A happy byproduct of making what had been a lifeless rock become a usable home, Eric said, leaving his elbows on the chair's arms while raising his hands upward like a shrug. And no one was suspicious? James, you know the reports. Officially, the exiles on Mars died out while trying to terraform it. Such was the finding of several investigative committees. The government took the word of the committees at face value, since it fit nicely with a way to help ease the continually burgeoning population of both Earth and Luna. And those of us on the committees knew how to keep ourselves hidden, Eric added, smiling and widening his eyes for emphasis. And that would be how, from the start, you could, I began, Eric finishing, work our way back into higher places at universities and in government. It, like the terraforming, took time and patience, but we did it. I remember my father taking me fishing on a lake in northern Wisconsin many times when I was a child. His message to me was always, patience is a virtue. Somewhat ironic, considering I truly believe he suffered from ADHD. But what was the pull for the workers to come, I asked. A pull, Eric crooned. A better word you could not have chosen. The pull was an obscure contract for a government building. Small, but nonetheless requiring skills the settlers did not possess. What settlers? I asked, thinking. I know you know. Voice it, Eric said, the professor and him finding its way to the surface through his voice, as well as a subtle chuckle. Your people, I said in realization. But how did you keep the Terran government from becoming too curious? Bribe the right people, and old flight records, land and building permits are suddenly unearthed in public records, right where they should be, Eric commented, as an expert chess master explained to his people a finishing maneuver. Once people began coming to and settling on Mars, it attracted attention from the upper class. Money poured in, as did workers to fill the need. Over time, you know how much, a small settlement turned into a colony, as well as the third pillar of the Terran interplanetary government, the Triune government. So, I once more began, thinking back on the article on LNH. I have to ask for my own good. Did the city create LNH, or did LNH create the city? Ah, your human interest piece. Laura and Hank were good friends, loyal to the cause. They were some of the last to finally give up their immortality. They stuck around to try and see things through, helped the new settlers adjust to the Martian climate, and took on personas that allowed them to give folksy advice. People trusted them, after all. The barkeeps of already established, scrappy settlers had to have some worthwhile wisdom to share. They were TDF? Atmo, I asked. They were Nanites, yes. I think Junior, the current owner, knows. It's a family secret. They never told him specifically about me, though, Eric replied. Somehow, even then, I knew that my article on LNH, while it would still be published, would not be as important as it had seemed at the time. Along with such a feeling was the knowledge that this new piece of the puzzle, that explained so much of the stories I had heard from the regulars and longtime patrons of LNH, could not be used for the article. Only here, in context, could it make enough sense to be included. Tucked away from the conversation with Eric, I kept highlighted the revelation about LNH's past, as well as my very odd experience with the man yet seated before me. An experience, once again, that opened my mind to the possibilities forthcoming in the days ahead. Mystery and Deceit from Earth to Mars, Book 1 of Chaos's Orbit Saga. Written by James T. Hall, narrated by Chris Pullman. Episode 11, How the Nanites Work. Visit us online at www.narclaninc.com to link up with us.